for another one of our Tele Artworks online lectures. Before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501(c) not-for-profit organization. Our Spring 1 session starts Monday, 3/25/24, and classes are open for registration on our website, theatelier@flowerfield.org. We offer a variety of fine art, drawing, painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio. We offer classes in illustration, anime, and digital painting as well. Our current exhibition is Not Just Another Pretty Flower by Mary Ahern, which runs until May 30th. The gallery is open 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Sunday. Tonight, Atelier artist and instructor Randall DiGiuseppe is presenting a lecture titled Vermeer, Behind the Canvas and the Camera. We welcome him this evening and hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room, and I shall hand it over to Randall now.
Thank you, Quinn, and thank you for joining me this evening for a lecture that I've been excited to share with you. Vermeer is always a big draw. He's captured the imagination of the modern world for, well, it wasn't always the case. We're going to explain why, but I titled this Vermeer, Behind the Canvas and the Camera. And during this talk, we're going to discuss, well, a number of his works, not all of them, and we're going to explore some of the new scholarship on this mysterious local as far as the Dutch go, painter that would become one of the most revered painters in the history of art. We might as well get started. John Vermeer, might as well lead with our knockout punch. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past 100 years, you probably recognize this painting, also known as the Mona Lisa of the North, most widely known as the girl with the pearl earring. We will be discussing her in greater depth as the lecture continues, but it gives you an idea of the mastery of Vermeer's craft, his ability to paint and convey light, luminosity, his perspective agility, and his draftsmanship. In this example that we'll be discussing as well, called the music lesson. What most of the time when we think of Vermeer, we think about his quiet paintings. They tend to be small in scale, females in interiors, doing domestic duties, lost in their own thoughts. And we're going to explore what makes those paintings unique as well, and why Vermeer stands out compared to the other masters of his time. Today, he's captured the imagination of us for so long now that, well, he's inspired a lot of pop culture and some famous, well, some great selling fictional books, like The Girl with the Pearl Earring, which is a motion picture, quite popular, and quite a few others. He's also reached the strata of pop culture. Here you can get some chocolate pearls for 4.9 fine euros in the Rijksmuseum's gift shop. This is available on the Walmart catalog. You get that delivered next day, the milkmaid. Which is hard to believe that he's reached this level of popularity among the masses, considering that none of this would have been made possible if it weren't for this man, who we'll discuss a little later on as well. This fellow, Etienne Joseph Théophile, also known to the alias Wilhelm Burger, we'll call him Burger in this case because it's a lot easier, was the pioneer responsible for saving Vermeer from the brink of oblivion. A lot of people don't realize, because we tend to take for granted, that Vermeer seemed to be around forever. But the fact is, after he died, he fell out of all memory and was on the verge of being lost forever if it wasn't for this particular scholar. He was a French journalist and political muckraker who ended up getting exiled from France in the 1840s. And his exile would end up being our benefit because it brought him to the Netherlands and started him on a trajectory that allowed us to, well, discover Vermeer. And if it weren't for Mr. Berger, we wouldn't have events that are typical of Vermeer, such as this. Here's a line. At the National Gallery of Art in 1995, now you might notice this, but the line goes around the block. And the gallery is actually the entrance is off to the far left. This was the largest retrospective of Vermeer's work in the United States to date. We're coming up to the 30th anniversary. This was 1995. But when I do these lectures, I like to usually break them down into the three sections so that we don't get inundated and overwhelmed with the material. This particular survey is going to be on a handful of his works. I don't want to go through all of them. What I'd like to do is inspire you to explore them further on your own and to pique your interest in this great master. So part one, we're going to be talking, I titled The Sphinx of Delft, his early origins and works. Part two, we'll be discussing his middle masterpieces, some more popular works, and we discuss the mysterious methods that he used. And then part three, we talk about the height of his career, the plummeting of his fame and fortunes and ultimate demise, and then his revival and what that entailed, and the hotly debated controversy about the methods that we think he may or may not use, followed by a Q&A. Before we go into part one, I just want to bring up a few facts about Vermeer's work. As of now, well, since I started lecturing on Vermeer, I have to say, I started lecturing on Vermeer about 15 years ago, and back then we had 43 paintings that were attributed to him. We're now down to 35, possibly, well, 34. It's controversial whether there's 35 now, but we now have 34 paintings attributed to the man. Fortunately for us, especially in the Northeast United States, 12 of those 34 are right here in the United States, and specifically in the Northeast. About 1/3 of the man's entire catalog can be seen in the United States, except for one of the pieces that's not listed here, which was the painting The Concert, which was heisted during the Boston Garden Museum heist in 1990. Sadly, its whereabouts, along with some other masterpieces, is still unknown. Of the 12, well, questionable 13 pieces that reside in the USA, I'll explain that question mark in a second. 3 are at the Frick Gallery in New York City. 5 are a 15-minute walk away up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So if you live in New York, one of the perks is you get to see 8 of Vermeer's 34 surviving paintings within a 15-minute walk of each other. And then you could take a 3-hour Amtrak down to Washington, D.C. to see the remaining 3 or 4. There's some dispute as to whether the fourth is authentic or not. And then maybe down to another one that they're questioning as well. And then we have one more in a private collection, the Leiden collection in New York, which is occasionally available for exhibit. This is the one painting at the National Gallery of Art, the one with a flute that is now in dispute as far as its authenticity. The conservators at the National Gallery in DC think that it is a copy from of a student. The Rijksmuseum disputes that. They still think it's a Vermeer. It's not signed so far as we can tell. And well, the debate is up for grabs to this day. And I figure that's going to be going on a while. As far as I would not be surprised if this was a Vermeer, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if it weren't. I'm leaning towards it being a Vermeer, and I'll explain a little later. A couple of facts about Vermeer's paintings. Of the 34 paintings, only 4 paintings are set outdoors. Only 2 Vermeer paintings of the entire catalog portray solitary male figures. It's the same model. One of them is the astronomer, the other one is the geographer. 17 of the 34 surviving paintings portray solitary women in interiors. 32 of his 34 paintings contain women. And incredibly, all of them fully clothed. There's not one nude in his entire catalog. So suffice to say that he had very strong feelings about women. My take is that he adored them. He cherished them and he admired them and he revered them to the point where he wanted to capture them in his work. One of the strange things about Vermeer is that and one of the biggest mysteries that make it very confusing to catalog his work in life is that there are no drawings, preparatory or otherwise, or personal letters by Vermeer that are known to exist. The amount of documentation about Vermeer's existence is surprisingly scarce. We know that he lived, he was born, we have a baptismal record. We know he got married, and we know that he was a member of a guild, and we know that he died because it's on a birth certificate, and very little else as far as documentation. And we'll get into that later as well. So let's dive into part one, the Sphinx of Delft. Look at his early works, the origins that made him who he was. This is believed to be, well, this is a detail from a painting I'll show you in a little bit of Vermeer. We assume that is him. It was a common device back in the Baroque and the Renaissance periods for an artist to put a self-portrait in on the far left or far right of a painting. And I'll explain that in detail a little later. This is also expected to, well, this is still controversial, but a lot of people believe that this is a self-portrait as well. It's Vermeer wearing his Sunday best. In fact, people argue that he's wearing the very same outfit. So if you notice that little fringe out here, that little strip, or the strips of the back here. So he's wearing the same jacket. So this might have been his trademark. This is another detail from another painting. We really don't know what he looks like. I am going to give him a benefit of the doubt and say that this is what he looked like. This is his back, and this is probably what his face looks like in his early 20s. So let's get started. We start in the town of Delft in Holland, where Vermeer was born in late October, either the 29th or the 30th. He was baptized on Halloween Day, 1632, which implies that he was born only a few days earlier. As tradition would have it back then, there were no birth certificates, so to speak. There were baptismal records, and babies were generally baptized shortly after they were born, usually a day or two afterwards. He was the second child and only son to Rainer Jans and his wife Digna Baltens. Give you an idea of, here's a map of modern day Holland. Delft is the town that he's from. Rather modest town. It was a merchant town. Had money. It wasn't as large population-wise as, say, the Hague, which was the seat of government in Holland, or Amsterdam, which is the largest populated to this day city in Holland. Delft in the 1630s had a population of roughly 25,000, while The Hague had 50, and Amsterdam probably had closer to 150,000. Today, you can reach Delft from Amsterdam. It's about an hour drive, 60 miles, and you're a stone's throw from either The Hague or Rotterdam. Off to the left here is the Atlantic Ocean. The lifeline of trade for Delft were the canals that led to around the Hook of Holland here and led to the city. Vermeer was born here, lived his entire life here, had his career there, and died within the boundaries of the city. This is a view of Delft and one of the many canals that Vermeer would have seen on a daily basis. And we know this because he portrayed it in this particular painting called The View of Delft. One of the most stunning landscapes, cityscapes that I've ever seen. This is one of the few cityscapes. He's done 2 cityscapes in his entire career. This is one of them. There's a photographic quality to it. The attention to light and detail and color are absolutely otherworldly. Well, actually, his technique is otherworldly, but this is something that we can all relate to. This is an image that looks like a slice of life that would project into our eyes if we were to sit here. But the fact is, we're looking at we're looking at an image that has a photographic quality to it, but Vermeer is manipulating this image quite a bit. A number of people have tried to mimic this using a device called the camera obscura, what we'll discuss a little later. And the conclusion is that Vermeer was a master manipulator. So if you look at the set here, and here, we have somebody who's trying to set up the same arrangement and alignment, and nobody can get it right. And the reason why this is because Vermeer is moving buildings and changing the light and moving cathedrals over into the left and to the right and creating this lovely setting rather. If we look down to the bottom here, he makes Delft looked like a very, very quiet and placid city, but anything but it's quite bustling, even to this day for a small town. It also shows some interaction between the genders and the classes. Here's some middle classmen in finer clothing. Here are uh, some maids, domestic servants, perhaps, by telling by their dress, interacting just right next door to this ferry. We're not sure what they're doing or what they're waiting for. And this is another trademark of Vermeer's work. He has a notorious ability to just give you enough to keep you interested and leave you hanging. You never really know what he's talking about. This is also one of the few paintings in the entire catalog that are in the landscape format, meaning that it's wider than it is taller. Most of them are in the portrait format. The vast majority of them are. In 1641, his father changes the surname to Vermeer. Why is anybody's guess. We have some suspicions as to why that is, and I'll explain that shortly. He becomes a member of the Guild of St. Luke. They represent the artists and a number of businessmen. He states his occupation as innkeeper and art dealer, which may seem like an eclectic mix, but this is important to point out because back in Vermeer's time in Holland, the inns and hotels played a very large role in showcasing artwork of the local artists. They didn't have museums in the same way we do now. The only time you would ever see a master's work was by appointment at the studio or during one of the annual art fairs. More often than not, if you had an agreement with an inn or a hotel, they would showcase your work in the tavern or in the hotel check-in or the lobby or gracing the halls. And it's funny because I have some students that occasionally will get an invitation to show their work in a local coffee house, and they'll shoot it down because it's not a gallery. I'll tell them by all means put it up because you never know who's going to buy a cup of coffee and be pulled, drawn to your work. 1653 is an important year for Vermeer. Again, you have to bear in mind there is very little documentation about the man from 1630, well, from the year he was born, 1623 to now. We just know he was born and that's it. We know that he proposed to a local girl, Katerina Bones, who was the daughter of a wealthy Dutch woman by the name of Maria Tilton, or Maria Tins, her mother, who rejects Vermeer's proposal. Number of reasons why. Vermeer was a Protestant, specifically a Calvinist, which was an orthodox form of Protestantism, and it was the predominant denomination in Holland at the time. Maria and her daughter were staunch Catholics, and on top of that, they had property, they had wealth. Vermeer was looking to marry up. In fact, there was very little in terms of assets or reputation he could have given to him. I should point out that Vermeer's paternal grandmother was arrested for running an illegal gambling ring, and his paternal grandfather was arrested for counterfeiting coins. And well, that's not to mention that his father did a stint in jail for manslaughter. So Vermeer came from very questionable stock, trying to marry into a noble family that was of a different denomination of Christianity. And somewhere down the line, we're not entirely sure how they met or why the bond between Vermeer and Katerina came together. It might have been a love connection and they just hit it off. We're not sure where or why. Again, it's a huge question. By the way, I wanted to show you an idea of just how staunch the Calvinists were. This is a Calvinist church, which was formerly a Catholic church. You might notice it's been whitewashed because the Calvinists believed that any form of a symbolism was seen as idolatry. So the stained glass was removed, as are the altars. That any of the statues are gone, and there's not even a crucifix. Catholicism in Holland was not illegal, but it was frowned upon, and it was behind closed doors, literally. And the way Catholics worshipped were in these secret, these secret churches that fronted as storefronts or houses, but inside they were gutted, such as this one. This is one of the secret Catholic churches in Holland. I believe this is in Amsterdam, but it wasn't uncommon to see these small churches inside a building with a facade that said it was something else. It was also common for there to be chapels that were in attics and apartments. So Vermeer somehow convinces Mariah to accept his proposal under the condition that he converts to Catholicism. And he does, and he marries Katerina, probably in one of the churches similar to what you see here. This is a signature between Katerina and Vermeer. This is in their marriage certificate. He moves in with his mother-in-law, Mariah, and Katerina, and his surviving mother into a building in the well-to-do section of Delft, right in the middle of town. He's not well-to-do. He's an aspiring artist with a questionable family reputation, and his mother-in-law has given her reluctant support and blessings for the marriage. He does get very staunchly involved with his with the local Jesuits who happen to live nearby. And this is a commissioned piece that he did. This is one of the earliest paintings he ever did. This is Christ in the House of Mary, Martha and Mary, or Mary and Martha. It's the largest painting he ever did. It was believed to be commissioned by the Jesuits while he was working on his catechism. And you see some very early hints of his craftsmanship and his use of light. You can see that it's 63 by 56. Most of his works are a fraction of this size. You can see it in the National Gallery in Edinburgh, Scotland. Jesus, it's a scene from the book of Luke, where Jesus is taking respite in the house of Mary and Martha and having this interesting composition here. Jesus is making eye contact with Martha while Mary is listening to him. Now, take a look at this pose. You'll see this repeated throughout Vermeer's work at later dates. So if you look at the book of Luke, chapter 10, explains what happens here. Jesus takes respite in the house of Mary and Martha. While he's lecturing Mary, Martha's asking him a question, and he's answering Martha. I'll leave the story up to you. 1653, after he converts and marries, he gets admitted to the Guild of St. Luke and states his occupation as master painter. And this is his signature on the ledger here, Johannes Vermeer, number 70. And he's in good company. Just above and number 77, what, 78. He's number 78 on the list right there. Number 75, Carolina Fabritas, happens to be Rembrandt's star pupil. And down here, Pieter de Hoek is number 80. So they all signed this register in 1653. He joins the Guild of Artists. The following year, in the same town, well, in the same neighborhood, there was a devastating explosion where the armory, 30 tons of gunpowder blew up, killed over 100 people, and injured and maimed 1,000 others. The reason I bring this up is that it was a pretty hectic time in Vermeer's life, and quite often artists respond to these type of incidents in their art, whether through commission or through personal sketches. And there seems to be no evidence that Vermeer had any sort of response to this at all, but I'm not entirely convinced of that. Because when we look at this painting here, Little Street, this is another cityscape. It's one of two. You don't see any indication of the devastation from this accident. Maybe there is some of the things where the wrought iron areas here bare, some things, structures might have been ripped off, but take a look at this portrait formatted cityscape that looks like any street in Delft. There's some hotly disputed, well, there's a strong debate as to where this is. People keep saying they keep finding it, but this looks like any street in Delft if you walk around. And I think that was what Vermeer was trying to reach, was trying to convey. But you notice it's very quiet. It's very somber. It's unlike Vermeer's household, which was actually quite crowded and loud. And everybody's kind of doing their own thing. Domestic shores. So, and you get the suspicion that there are things going on behind the doors. And we're curious. We keep looking through every one of these windows. Maybe we can see somebody. And what you'll also notice too, that none of the figures in this painting are remotely interested in the viewer. They're all kind of caught up in their own thing. Then you look at, well, in comparison to another painter, Pieter de Hoek was a master at the time, done about the same time. Here's a city street he did. Now compare this with Vermeer's. It's much more figuratively prioritized. Mother with daughter It's a woman contemplating what's going on the other side. Perspective is pretty solid. Not entirely sure what this is about, but there's more of a dialogue between the viewer and the figures in the painting, almost as if it were staged. Here we don't get that. We don't get that sensation at all. We're looking at a painting and we get the sense we're less viewers and we're more eavesdroppers. They have no idea that we're looking at them. It's almost as if we're not supposed to, and and it invites us even more into the world that is Vermeer's paintings. I'm going to zoom up over here. You'll see that there's a mom here, I'm guessing, and she's doing some lace making or embroidery. And down here are two children, either playing a game or they're harassing some little animal. But enjoy it while it lasts, folks. These two children are the only two children that Vermeer conveys in any of his work. These are the only two children in the entire catalog so far as we can tell. And then he goes off and he does this very curious piece called the Procurus in 1656. We know this because this is the earliest painting Vermeer ever dated. Another display of his mastery of paint and luminosity and light and his artistic agility. You might notice here on the far left here is what we assume to be Vermeer's self-portrait. You get a better idea of the outfit that we'll see repeated in other scenes. This is a beautiful painting of a very salacious scene of what seems to be an inebriated prostitute, tell by her cheeks being incredibly red. This soldier is going to give her some money for services rendered or about to be rendered. I will spare you the details. We're assuming that this may be the madam. And this is one of the few times in Vermeer's catalog, there are only a handful of times where there's a figure that is connecting to the viewer, namely, well, I'll say and give him the benefit of the doubt and say that that's him, making eye contact with the viewer on this outstanding painting of a very strange scene of a prostitute being propositioned by what seems like more than one man. We're still figuring out who this person is, rather mysterious. And it's interesting, but it dawned on me for the first time when looking at this that I've seen this painting before. Why does this seem so familiar? And I see that compositionally, this beautiful foreshortened hand, this slouched figure sitting this way, and then this like a triangle composition. And it dawned on me that it reminded me a lot of this painting. Dead center in the hand, Jesus' foreshortened hand, sort of gently pointing to the attentive Mary. It's almost like he used the same composition for the same painting. If you look, it's almost as if he took the basic geometry of this one biblical scene and transported it onto this scene. The hands are dead center, foreshortened, the slouch. This figure here can be parallel to this figure here. Well, again, this is part of Vermeer's intrigue. I'm going to say that I'll leave it for you to be the judge. Again, Vermeer, in his masters, he was not only a master of painting luminosity and light and intimate scenes, but he was also a master of leaving us hanging, just giving us just enough to wonder what on earth is he talking about. But I found it jarring when I looked at these two, and they're also very similar in size and dimension. It's just two different themes: the savior of mankind, and then there's a prostitute done in kind of the same position with a contrasting colors. We can go on and on just about these two paintings, but let's not do that. Onward and upward. Let's take 5 minutes. I'll give you an opportunity to well, get a drink, go to the bathroom, come up with some questions. It's 7:30 now, 7:31, and let's return at 7:30. I'll come back at 7:35, and I'll field some questions you may have, and then we'll move forward into the middle portion of his career. I'm going to step off here. See you in 5 minutes. All right. I am back. Okay, folks. Does anybody have any questions moving forward? Because we will have a Q&A at the end of this. So I figure what we could do is I can, if you had any questions that were uh, any immediate questions about the material that we covered, I can answer that now. All right. I think I will move on. Second here. Okay. Part 2, Let There Be Light, the middle masterpieces. See if you can see that. I'm going to contract my window here. Want to make sure you can see my screen. There we go. We're going to start taking a deeper dive into his work. Now that we know a little about the man, not much more. He's still a riddle, and we won't learn. Well, you'll come to realize that we know a lot more about him than we did in a very long time, thanks to a couple of committed scholars. And we're going to look at some works that really stand out. And again, we'll look at 4 before we go into the next break. A couple of things to point out about Vermeer and his domestic life. He fathered 14 children with Katerina. Yes, kept them busy, 11 of which survived. So he had 11 mouths, well, correction, 12 mouths to feed. Actually, correction, his mother was with him, 13 mouths to feed. Pretty sure his mother-in-law was thrilled with that arrangement. No shortage of material for mother-in-law jokes in his house, no doubt. It was a big house, but it was pretty clear that it was very crowded. 14 children is a lot. If you're curious, that there was another master that had more children. That was Johann Sebastian Bach, who had 20. That's basically a basketball team plus a farm league. Among the 11 children, all of them were raised as Catholics. So Vermeer was all in. And he frequently interacted with the local Jesuit order who lived, I believe, next door to the house. So his interactions with the Catholics and the Catholic faith was quite unique for a Dutch artist at the time. And I do believe that it played a role in his artistic development. We're going to go into one of the first solitary women in the interior genre, lost in her own thoughts, with one of the earlier pieces in his catalog. It's titled Girl Reading a Letter at an Open Window. It was created circa 1657, 59. What we're looking at here was the work of art. I have known it my entire adult and, well, formative years. It's obviously a profile with a single light source off to the left here, that window that illuminates this entire scene. For the longest time, it was assumed to be, well, it worked its way to Dresden because it was assumed that it was work from another artist. Some people thought it was Rembrandt. Some people thought it was Terborch or de Hoogh. No one would ever think it was Vermeer because most people, almost everyone outside of Delft during Vermeer's lifetime and beyond, had no idea Vermeer even existed, let alone that he painted. But it turns out, after some restorations, we found out this was in fact Vermeer, and it's been signed. What we see here is a quintessential Vermeer scene. Young woman, center of the composition. This green blind is pulled over almost like a curtain at a theater. And what's being revealed to us is this, well, the scene that we're eavesdropping in on. She's reading a letter and obviously taking it very seriously, tell by the pensive look on her face, but she's also clasping it with both hands. There's a lot of symbolism here, and I don't want to get too caught up in that. There could be pitfalls if I interpret it too much. Excuse me. But it's pretty sure we're pretty sure that she's pretty deeply involved in it. We're not sure whether she's swooning over it or whether she's upset. It used to be interpreted that this was a letter that was about some lover's demise because this looked very skeletal to some, and thought that this might be an allegory of a letter explaining the death of a loved one, and things weren't exactly hunky-dory because the still life here is disrupted. As you can see, this beautiful oriental rug that's bunched up here and tilting over the still life. So things are in disarray. At least that's what we thought for the longest time. Because this painting happened to be restored quite a bit. And it was well, refurbished and repurposed, it seemed. We found out that this painting was covered up by a coat of paint. And we assumed it was the artist that did this, but then with advances in forensic technology, we realized that this edition, this cover up here, was done 40 years after the artist's death. So they decided in 2019 to remove it, which changed the entire context of this painting from a letter of despair to, well, we also see that it's a much more luminous painting than we thought initially. This sign of Cupid, the symbol of love, as she's reading this letter, as the light is not as dark and ominous as we thought. It's quite amazing. So now we went from doom and gloom to love and promise in the same in one fell swoop of removing this. The restoration was completed in 2021, so I've lived my entire adult life looking at that other painting, thinking it meant something else. So there's always this pitfall when you're looking at works of art. I want you to also look at this chair. Vermeer tends to recycle costumes, models, and props. This is what's known as the Spanish chair. Two little lion heads here. And you'll see this chair star in some other paintings as we move forward. But this is again, I want to get your whet your appetite, get you started on what you can expect to see in Vermeer's catalog as he starts to mature. And you compare this to a contemporary master who does the same thing, Gerard Terborch, who is a more well-known artist in Vermeer's time and was quite the rock star in his own right. But you would compare the two in terms of mood. The background is subdued and dark. She's always overlit. She's luminous. It's a beautiful painting. It's beautifully done. And you fall into it very similarly, but there's something about Vermeer's setup here, this composition. Someone will argue that this is a better painting. And there's some, and some will argue that Gerard Terborch was a better painter. Catches the texture of the skin and the detail and the figure in the face, and it's quite lovely. I would argue that Vermeer is the better artist, even if he may not. Whether he's the better painter is in dispute. I like them both, but I think Vermeer gets the nod for me in comparing these two letter writers. Moving on to another piece here. You might be, well, let's take a look. You see this outfit? You see this chair? See this window? Well, here they are again. Same model, I'm assuming. There's that Spanish chair with the lion head. There's there are two chairs. This was called the Officer and Laughing Girl. This is right here in New York at the Frick collection. It's beautifully framed and composed. Again, the room is illuminated by this single window. The space is exaggerated by the fact that this figure is, well, almost overly, he overwhelms the scene. He's almost too large. And I think that Vermeer deliberately forces this perspective. What this does is it creates an illusion that she's the showcase. Our eyes are immediately drawn to this girl who is talking to this soldier, and she seems to be enjoying his company. You might notice that when she's in the presence of a man, at least in this case, she's wearing a modest uh, kerchief over her head, which was common in Dutch society back then. According to the Calvinists, they weren't exactly the most fun group around at the time. They were very stringent about how people presented themselves in public. And in public, a woman was not, pretty much from the chin down, a woman was not allowed to reveal anything, and from the wrist from the wrist be up, we're not allowed to be seen. And this is very interesting because you can actually see she rolls up her forearm here, which some people believe have erotic undertones. This has been interpreted and misinterpreted for years, this painting. A couple of things I should point out. You might remember this outfit. He is an officer. He's wearing the same uniform as the guy in the Procuress that was with the prostitute. No, I don't buy that this is a proposition. I do think that this is Vermeer's attempt to capture two people hitting it off that generally like each other, who are in love. Up above here is a map that still survives, believe it or not, of Holland. And Vermeer goes into explicit detail as if this is the land mass and that's the water mass. But he does something rather curious with the map in the back. The original surviving maps had the map of Holland and the earth and all the terrain is off-white and the ocean and the surrounding water is blue. But he inverts it. Why would he do that? I think he was doing it for compositional purposes, above all else, because he felt that if he did it another way, it would have framed the painting differently. But again, this is a beautiful example of two people who are hitting it off. Pretty clear. She's smiling. She doesn't look like she's under any duress. She's having a drink. She may be offering him a drink. And I would argue, and this again comes, this is there's nothing substantiating my claim here, but it's quite possible that these two pieces are companion pieces. And I'm not sure which one comes first. Is she getting a love letter? And then later on, well, is this letter saying to her that her love is arriving and she's receiving company and this is going on? Or is this an interpretation of he's going out on duty and he's going to be out of town and she's seeing him off and this is the second part? Who's to say these two are even companion pieces? Anybody's guess, but you're starting to see Vermeer handle themes and repeat this theme quite often. He no longer follows the template of heroic uh, and historic portrayals that you see in a lot of Dutch paintings. So what influences Vermeer in his art? Because art on the whole is responsive. We respond to the philosophy and the politics of the time, the technology at the time, any breakthroughs, things that are going on in our domestic life. We can't avoid it. It's just part of being an artist. Things happen to us and they affect the way we paint. Well, there are a couple of things I think are important to point out. 1662, Vermeer is not, well, he's a member of the Guild of St. Luke, but now he's appointed a high station as the vice dean of the St. Luke's Guild. Now he holds office there. His Catholic conversion is also important. I'll explain it in a little bit. Because the theology of the Jesuits, which is one of the reasons why I think there's a big difference between these two paintings, and one of the principal tenets of Catholicism is that God reveals himself and the universe through light. It's the first thing that's created by God in the book of Genesis. Let there be light. It's also the overlying, it's the overwhelming message of the Gothic world, which is to let light into the interior. So this may have played a huge role in Vermeer's psyche and his obsession with light and the optics of the time. He also had a very hectic domestic life. Remember, he lived with 11 children and 3 adults, and that's not including the maid or the maids. So in his life, it was probably very loud, very busy. He probably didn't have a moment's peace, and he lived in the heart of town. And among the people that lived in his life, and we should point this out, and I think it's very important, were the strong female influences in his life. Katerina, his wife, who he clearly adored. They stayed together till the end of their days. Among their 11 children, at least 7 were daughters. And on top of the fact that he's living with his mother-in-law, there's maids in the house. And I think that played a huge role in his artistic development. So all of these things played a big role in what made Vermeer unique. And yeah, in a strange way, his Catholicism and their emphasis on light may have played a huge role in his portrayal of light and the priority of light in his works. Optics was a huge thing back then, especially in Holland, the big revolution. Christian Huygens is an example with the telescope. This is a time of scientific upheaval. Only 20 years before Vermeer was born, the entire mechanism of the universe had changed. We were no longer the center of the universe. Now we have guys like Galileo and Kepler rewriting how we portray the universe. I mean, we're getting to the point now where these guys are so smart that we know mathematically how far planets are without having to go near them and calculating the size of these planets and their orbital periods. There's an optics revolution that goes not only to outer space, but inner space. Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, the father of microbiology, invented the microscope, who happened to be an acquaintance and maybe even a close friend of Vermeer. We're not entirely sure what his connection to Vermeer was, but he does play an important role in his life later on. This is a painting of him looking through a microscope. So optics, again, were a big thing. And then there was this interesting rediscovery, this phenomena, this principle called the camera obscura. This is how the camera obscura applies. So light enters a pinhole and then it's projected either through a lens or from the pinhole, an inverted image of what's outside. The light rays, being that light travels in straight lines, project onto a board or a canvas, which can be traced. This was a copy of a camera obscura that we know that the Jesuits owned. They had a fascination with the camera obscura too, and that was because of their infatuation with, again, the theology of light and God's revealing the universe through light. This is another camera obscura, similar model, and how it would be used was that the image would be projected and reflected and illuminated onto a piece of tracing paper, and you can trace what is being portrayed out here. Now, the hotly debated topic about Vermeer is just how much did he use the camera obscura, if he used one at all. And the problem is there's no material evidence that Vermeer even used a camera obscura. It's quite possible. It's quite likely, actually, because he would have had access to it. And a lot of his paintings do have a photographic sensibility. But in my opinion, it was, if he did use it, it was more of a tool than a crutch. It wasn't something he used to just try to nail things down. And well, moving forward, another influence into why Vermeer was painting what he was painting and how he was painting. So he didn't have to please the gallery because there was another scholar, the 21st century Wilhelm Berger, John Michael Montias, who was an economist turned Vermeer historian, who up until recently, for the past 15 years, discovered after thoroughly looking at the archives of the town of Delft, that Vermeer had a patron, Peter van Ruyven. This plays a huge role. Van Ruyven was a very wealthy merchant in Delft whose family ran a brewery and other business ventures, and he loved art and collected art. He also gave Vermeer carte blanche to make certain pieces, which might explain the mystery of, and this is something I should have mentioned earlier, Vermeer's paintings are all done with the finest materials, the best oil paints that you can find, the finest linens, the best brushes. He uses the best minerals is suspended in the best linseed oils to suspend them in. How does an artist that have no money, that has very few little assets, and I'm pretty sure his mother-in-law didn't subsidize his projects, how does he do this? Well, we've come to the conclusion that Mr. Van Ruyven here, who was a big fan of Vermeer and a big supporter, gave him the financial backing to paint however he liked and whatever he wanted, or at least within reason. And we'll see that in a little bit. This is a good example of Vermeer at his artistic height. Here he's flexing his perspective muscle and his artistic agility. This is one of the commissions to Van Ruyven, believe it or not. This is the music lesson. You can see this in Buckingham Palace in the King's Gallery in England, 29 by 25. It's a unique painting, and it's the only Vermeer painting that shows two sets of windows. You might notice that this model here may very well be, well, she's wearing the same outfit, if you look carefully, as the woman that's reading a note by the window. This fellow may be the same model that was with the soldier in the red outfit. And what we're looking at here is the portrayal of what seems to be a music lesson. Here's the teacher. He's kind of keeping tempo with the stick. She's playing the virginal. And we are, again, eavesdropping in on this scene. We're not active participants of this painting. Again, Vermeer is repeating some of his props here. He's using that Persian rug thrown over as a cloth on the table. He's got a still life with this sterling silver plate and this custom water vessel. And again, we have the lion chair with a new upholstery, and this beautifully rendered image of this young student playing this virginal. In fact, a couple of these models still exist. This viola da gamba here was added later on, maybe for compositional purposes. But look at this beautiful cadmium red pushed up against here. And if you squint, it's still an effective abstract painting. And I'll see later on what I'm talking about. This beautifully, very expensive marble tiled floor being illuminated again by these light sources off to the side here. And this is a rather curious depiction here I wanted to point out. We see that those two are not alone in the room. This window, this is actually a mirror projecting the student. And behind here, we see the back of the table, and this is the leg of the easel. So now what this is saying is that there is a third person in the painting, which is the artist. And you're getting the perspective of the artist while this drama is playing through. Stunning painting. There have been numerous attempts to recreate this painting through optics, because a lot of people believe that Vermeer was not only using the camera obscura, but he was dependent on it to create these illusions. And again, a very controversial subject. But this is Vermeer at his, I mean, he's at this point, he's just showing off what he can do. What makes Vermeer stand out as well, if you compare it to this painting here, again, this, I believe, is Terborg, another music lesson. A little more subdued, beautifully painted. There are some photographic, so to speak, qualities here in the figures, but again, somewhat staged, and they almost look like they're posing for the viewer. I don't get the sense of voyeurism that I do when I look at a Vermeer. Vermeer also, he almost seems like he's painting with light. He eliminates line altogether. Forms are crafted solely through the use of tones and values and chroma. There's very little in terms of any drawing that is revealed here. That's not to say he didn't draw. I mean, he would have to have this prepared here to create the vanishing points for these tiles going this way and this angle going this way, and a vanishing point going this way. It was pretty clear that Vermeer was a master of perspective. And again, if he were to use a camera obscura for this, I would assume he was using it mainly for cropping and compositional purposes. As far as matching colors, to be honest, it's close to, well, I think it's impossible to match colors when you're projecting something onto a white wall, because if you try to match the colors and paint over them, you're going to get different colors. And then I wanted to finish part two, looking at what people might, well, many people and scholars consider this his magnum opus, The Milkmaid. A little background on this one. This was painted shortly after a domestic incident at his home, where his mother-in-law, Mariah, I failed to mention that Mariah and Katerina grew up in a house of a chronic domestic abuser. Mariah's husband, uh, and there are documents and affidavits proving this, had often beaten his wife black and blue and within inches of her life. She ended up getting separated, but at the same time, her son, Katerina's brother, inherited that trait, unfortunately, and was a domestic abuser. And there was one incident shortly, well, 1556, where the son showed up at the door in a drunken rage and beat Mariah till Tim's and almost killed Vermeer's wife, who was pregnant at the time. And it turned out that their maid, Tonica Everpole, got in between the two and de-escalated the incident. And some people believe that this is a portrayal and an exaltation of Tonica Everpole. Now you think about this previous painting we looked at. I mean, this is a prestigious home, very wealthy. This is a floor. If this was a studio, Vermeer had to borrow it because there's no way he would have been able to afford this kind of floor and instrument, let alone uh, anything else. I'm not sure how generous Mr. Van Ruypen was with his subsidies here, but I doubt that he would have laid out an entire studio for him. Who knows? But then we look at this one, this masterpiece in humility, where he exalts a domestic milkmaid. Unlike the other wall, the wall where there's these master paintings and these bits of furniture, we look at a bare wall with chipped paint, a nail where something was hanging. There's another nail, and there's a hole in the wall right here. You can actually see the chips in the wall. Vermeer actually goes as far as to paint the chips in the wall. He's painting who a lot of people think is the maid in the house. Now, we're not entirely sure. There's nothing substantiating this claim. But if we look at this, this is a very quiet scene. Beautifully lit, illuminated from this principal window in this not very fancy house. In fact, this is a rather typical home that you would see back then. And you can tell that looking at the floor, there's no fancy tile. In fact, how would I call it? Middle class, working class, that these tiles are put here to keep the rest of the wall from falling apart from moisture or the broom hitting it. And you might notice this little box here. This is a foot heater. So somebody would put little charcoals or embers in there, and when the weather was cold, the domestic females would go and they put their skirts over that and warm up their feet and their lower bodies when it was cold outside. But what we're looking at here is this beautifully rendered painting of this foreshortened. I mean, she's not Athena coming back from conquering some uh, legion somewhere, or Joan of Arc marching in. This is a milkmaid being exalted at the highest level. And look at this. She's just pouring milk into a vessel, beautifully painted bread. And you'll notice too that some people have made implication that this is some erotic scene. I'm not entirely sold on that. And the reason why is again, I'm seeing this from a modern context, but you see her tanned hands and tanned face, but she rolls up her sleeves, and now you're getting a lot more skin here, that alabaster white skin that gets no sunlight because it's usually covered under the suppressed Dutch society. So you're getting a bare arm that's lit up. And what's interesting too is that Vermeer paints this blue using the highest quality ultramarine on the market. It contained lapis lazuli. It's a very expensive mineral that's quarried out of Afghanistan. And the translucence of this paint when it's glazed cannot be translated on any screen by any photograph. It's something that the human eye has to catch. You have to go and see it. And it's usually saved and used for religious paintings. Mary's shawl is usually done in lapis lazuli. Even Jesus's robes are done with it. In fact, the earlier painting of Jesus in the house of Mary and Martha, he doesn't use lapis lazuli. He uses a lower grade ultramarine, but he uses the best materials to exalt this maid. Love the light captures her forehead. She is completely caught up in her thoughts here. Some people think that there might be some undertones in the, well, some religious undertones here, of the communion, the milk of life. These up here are just domestic baskets. They're raised off of the ground to keep the bread fresh and away from rodents. There's a brass container there that she probably takes to market. But again, she's going on, lost in her own thoughts, completely unaware that she's being viewed by, well, an adoring public. And I think one of his greatest works. It's so masterful in its humility. This is he shows his artistic agility without smashing you over the head with a lot of bells and whistles. Let's take 5 minutes before we go into the final stage of this talk. We'll get into Vermeer's, well, some of his most famous works, some groundbreaking works, and then we'll go into his legacy, and then I'll open up for some Q&A. So I'll start in 12, well, it's 8:07, so we'll resume at 8:12, okay? All right, we're back for the final push in our discussion today. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any in the bin there.
I got a really quick question, if I may.
Certainly.
Very first painting that you showed with Martha and Mary, and how old was he there? Because they don't look anything like his mid work and later work.
Those are the earliest works.
Um,
16
um,
so circa 1653. He was in his early 20s.
okay, all
And
right. Because
it was shortly after he was married and converted to Catholicism. It was a commission for the Jesuits.
right, no, it's not the subject matter. It's just that they artistically, even as a kid, I used to look at that and say it doesn't look anything like his later paintings.
Yeah. You see some hints of it. There's some slight, especially in the gesture of Mary by his as she's holding her head up with her chin and the way the light is handling on there. But yeah, those it's a very early work.
Okay, thank you.
You got it. Anyone else? We'll move on then. Okay, final stretch here. Part three. Look at the his death, resurrection, and last judgment on the matter of speaking. We wouldn't go out tonight without discussing his most famous painting. But I do want to I want to give you a little primer for this, a little story behind how this came to be and why, well, and how it's become one of the most adored paintings in, well, in all time. So once upon a time, well, actually, more accurately, in 1881, there was a man by the name of Andreas de Thom who went to an estate sale at The Hague to look at some paintings. Uh, One of the paintings went up at auction. Uh, it was deemed by the curators as unsellable, but they gave it a shot anyway. Uh, it was sold to Mr. de Thom for a price of 2 guilders and 40 cents. In 1881, that translated into modern currency to about $32. Now, before you get on anybody about, well, why would anybody charge only $32 for this painting? You have to realize that when he got the painting, the status was that it was in a very sad state of disrepair. The paint was falling off of it. It was coming off the frame. They didn't know who painted it. In fact, there was a restorer who came up with a composite of what the painting must have looked like when de Thom purchased it. It looks something like this. Sadly, there's little dark spots here. Let me just get my laser pointer up. Are areas where the paint chipped away. And there were some futile attempts to restore it early on. But for the most part, it was just left to languish in some storage. They're not sure, and they weren't sure who painted it at the time. But a couple of restorers even told de Thom, look, you're better off throwing it away. There's nothing we can do for it. But he just could not get himself to do it. He held on to it because he liked it. And shortly before he passed away, in 1902, he donated the painting to the Morris House Museum in The Hague, where they restored it. Well, this is the modern restoration going back to 1994. But prior to that, there were a number of attempts to restore the painting. 1918, and then there was another one in 1940 that actually, this is where they discovered that this was a Vermeer. You could actually see it's fading here, though. There's the M-E-E-R, so the signature was up here. And since then, this painting has been considered one of the most popular paintings, well, in the history of art. And I'm not sure if any of you were fortunate enough to be in New York when it was on display at the Frick, when the Morris House Museum was lending it out while they were renovating for 6 months. It was an unbelievable experience for me. I didn't know if I would ever get to see this painting in person. I became a higher tier member of the Frick, so I'd have the privilege of seeing this painting when I could. In the 6 months, I saw this painting 7 times. First time I saw this painting, I wanted to hit the floor and drop to my knees. There are a handful of times in my life where I've had this kind of experience when this painting needs to be seen in person. The luminous quality, the theme, the mystery, the overall beauty of it was just so moving that I just could not stop staring at it. I kept going back. I kept going back. And there have been a very few number of times in my life where I felt that sensation. One of them was recently during the totality of the eclipse back on April 8th. The first time I walked to the edge of the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and then when the first time I laid eyes on the girl with the pearl earring. It's a very small painting, I should point out, 18 by 15. Everybody's kind of marvels at it, but unlike other paintings that, let's like say, for instance, the Mona Lisa, when you see it, it's behind bulletproof glass and it's kind of dark and mysterious. This painting is so luminous, even under all of the protection. It stands almost like you're looking at a high definition screen. And in a lot of ways, it's very atypical of a Vermeer painting that we've looked at in the past. We do have a solitary woman, yeah, but we don't have a highly luminous background. In fact, the original background wasn't this black. It was actually dark green with folds, but the paints have since deteriorated and decayed, and we have this dark patch here, and we just made do with it. And we've come to accept what we're looking at. So we have this painting here, again, atypical of a Vermeer. The female is making eye contact with us. And you just don't want it to stop. It's not an awkward eye contact. Like, well, what are you looking at? You want to turn the other way. You just fall into that gaze and you're just trapped and you just can't get out. You never want it to end. And that's how I felt when I went to see this painting. He used it, well, in this case as well, he used some lapis lazuli here. This is not, I should point out, a portrait in the true sense. It's what's called a trony. And a trony is a genre of painting where people would dress up in costume. I guess the closest thing we have in modern times to explain a trony is cosplay. She's a Turkish servant in this. Obviously, she's of northern descent, but she's dressed in an exotic Near East costume with a turban. Originally, it was called the girl with the turban in some catalogs, and this is the famed pearl earring that some people claim it's not a pearl. Whatever. The point is that we have an incredibly beautiful painting of this engaging face, angelic face. Again, we don't know who. It could have been his daughter. It could have been one of the moms. Could have been a maid. It could have been anybody. But the point is, it doesn't matter. We just love this image so much, and it just captures our attention and our emotions. And the way he just eliminates, again, any sense of line. It's not to say he didn't use line to prepare any of this, but he paints, it's almost as if he's painting with light. There's this beautiful reflective light bouncing off of the collar and illuminating her chin here, and this beautiful constellation of gloss on her lips. See that little shine here at the end of the lips, and then there's 3 stars here, almost like the belt of Orion, right? And then you just fall into those eyes. You don't see her hair, doesn't matter. She's a timeless beauty who is engaging the viewer for all eternity. In the most humble environment, we don't have a background. Again, very un-Vermeerish, I guess. I don't know the proper verb for that. But atypical, but with things that are typical. She's almost hyper-illuminated. So we know that the light source is off to the top left. She's getting flooded with light, but at the same time, the background is pushed in the back. It's almost like she's in a cave or in some abyss. But she's just lit like an angel. There's just something otherworldly about the lighting. And I just can't get enough of this painting. And even though I've seen it 7 times and my wife and I went on a couple of members-only evenings to see it, where it was just me and her and a handful of people and a guard, as opposed to the throng. I don't know if you ever remember this when it was going on, but when Girl with the Pearl Earring was at the Frick back in 2014, the line went down 70th Street and then up Fifth Avenue a couple of streets. And you know what? For those people that waited, I can tell you, I'm pretty sure everybody there thought it was worth it. It's just that amazing. So if you ever go to the Netherlands, I strongly advise you to go to the Morris House Museum to see this painting, because the Morris House Museum had stated that the loan to the Frick would be the last time the girl with the pearl earring, would ever leave the confines of that building, which was one of the reasons why I went out there and saw it when I did. And if you missed it, by all means, get out there and see it if you can. It's one of those bucket list paintings. I guarantee you, you won't be disappointed. This painting here kind of harkens back to the music lesson. This painting I find this painting to be an extremely important one because it was done for artists. This was a commission that Vermeer did for the Guild of St. Luke. And we know that it was titled The Art of Painting because that's what it says on the invoice. This is Vermeer pulling out all the stops. Again, he just wants to show everybody what he's got. And he maxes that out in ways that are just, well, to me, I'm speechless when I look at it. Some would argue this is his magnum opus. I have a strong appreciation for this painting because, again, the audience for this painting were painters. So I'm not saying that we have a different strata of appreciation for this. All I'm saying is, well, how would I put it? Being a painter and listening to a painter talk about painting is quite remarkable. And in a weird way, I feel like he's talking to us as craftsmen here. Because again, you have to realize that this wasn't meant to be on public display. It was meant to be at the headquarters of this guild. And there are a lot of fictional undertones here. For starters, he's in a studio that no artist of his status would possibly afford, with that marble floor and this elaborate brass chandelier and this custom-made map, which we know exists. There's actually a copy of it. He takes liberties with it. He flips it 90 degrees. This map, the original one is in another direction, but he changes it, I guess, for compositional purposes. Much like the first painting we had with the girls reading the letter, this drapery is pulled aside, almost like a curtain at a theater. One could even argue that the hand of the viewer is holding it over here while we're looking in, eavesdropping on this scene of the artist, who we can only surmise is somewhat may have been a self-portrait. I'll say it's a self-portrait because I have an interesting interpretation of what we're looking at here. It's the artist dressed in his Sunday best. To be honest, this would be similar to me wearing my wedding suit and getting married. I guess Vermeer wants to show that he's so skilled with painting that he'd wear his Sunday best and not get dirty. That's at least one interpretation. He's painting the muse Cleo, who's in front of this map of Amsterdam. And there are all of these props with a wide variety of symbolisms. By here also there's that chair again, but that the line is being obscured, right? But what I find fascinating about this, and I guess because Vermeer was so mysterious as far as his method, I think he gives us a little hint on his approach. Well, that's the map I was talking about, and then he flipped it. If we look closely, here's his signature. You can see how detailed he gets into these little vignettes here along the map. But here's his signature right here. So we know we did it. There's another one. But what I really wanted to show you was this painting. And unless you're a painter or familiar with painting, you'll be a little confused by what you're looking at. He's using a maul stick, which is a stick that an artist uses about a yard long, where an artist rests his drafting hand over it so he doesn't smudge the painting he's trying to paint. So this is kind of a fulcrum here. And then his opposite hand is holding the opposite side of the stick. So this keeps his hand clear of the canvas. We also see that the canvas is tinted. But what I find fascinating, let's look at this. For all those who say that Vermeer just did nothing but trace and that there was no preparatory painting, if this is in fact a self-portrait of Vermeer, and this is a sliver of what Vermeer did to create art, look at this. This is using mineral spirits and erasing these portions. He's created a preparatory drawing of Cleo. That sleeve. That's this right here. This is her laurel up top. He's filling in within the lines. And these are those preparatory lines. This may crack the code as to how Vermeer painted his paintings. fine linen, tinted off white, with a thinner as his underpainting. That's why we can't find any silver pointed graphite or lines beyond the painting. It's almost as if he's painting not with paint, but with beams of light. And this gives us a little hint of this. And you might notice something as well. There's no camera obscura anywhere. If he's using one, it's probably off to the side, but what he's showing is that this artist is painting this paint through life and observation, and this is the method. Now, some may argue, some detractors are saying, well, you're saying that he's tipping his hand. I say that he's throwing off his scent. Well, that's, again, something we're just going to have to agree to disagree on. But this is why I find this painting extremely important, especially in the artistic community, that if this is, in fact, a autobiographical painting of Vermeer and a little taste of how he approaches paintings, it's shown here in the art of painting. Again, remember, this painting was done by a master painter for a guild of master painters. The audience was specific. So as a painter, and those of my students, take heed of what we're looking at here. I think we're on to how Vermeer approached his paintings now. Again, I'm pretty sure there'll be a scholar that calls me up tomorrow and tells me that I'm full of crap, but that's okay. Everything's gumming up roses for Vermeer. He's painting what he wants to paint. Money's flowing in. You know, nothing can stop him now. He's at the height of his game until 1672. Such is life, the wheels come off. The Rompiar. That's what it's so a year that was so bad the Dutch actually gave a name to it, which translates into the disaster year. What happened during the Rompiar? Well, King Louis of France decides to invade the Netherlands. England has a falling out with a trade agreement with the Netherlands. So now Holland is on edge. They're getting ready for war. The art market in the Netherlands craters. It ceases. Nobody's buying paintings now because they're getting ready for the invasion of the French. Now, this is a problem, especially if you are a master painter and that's your occupation and you work commission only. So Vermeer's sole source of income is hit a wall, so far as we can tell. He's also a member of the Guard. He's obligated to fight for the town if there's an invasion. But he manages to whittle himself out of that obligation. I think it might be because he has 11 children, or he might have some connections that got him away from that. But his problems didn't end. Some of his business ventures with his mother-in-law went belly up. And one of the reasons that the money stopped flowing in the household on his mother-in-law's side was because the Dutch had a very interesting strategy in terms of dealing with invaders. And then when there was an aggressor, they would bust the dikes and flood the territory, and there'd be nothing for them to invade. It would just be a very cumbersome approach. The problem in this case is when they busted the dikes in Delft, they destroyed a good number of his mother-in-law, Maria Tims's properties, where she relied heavily on the revenues and the rents and whatever agriculture was coming from. So they went from having a decent income to zero. Now, one would ask, why would Vermeer stick around in this hostile environment? Why not move to Amsterdam, where the market's hot? Well, one problem is again, he had a sole patron, which proved to be problematic because Van Ruyven's would buy his work, and it would never leave the confines of Delft. So most people didn't know who he was outside of Delft, so he stayed put. Also, moving's pretty stressful, especially when you have a big family, right? My wife and I have a dog and a cat. If we decided to relocate, we would have to find some place that would accommodate a dog and a cat. Just imagine being married with a mother-in-law and a surviving mom and 11 children and going into a new town. It was just, the logistics would just make it really difficult. And well, Vermeer was getting obviously stressed by the situation. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, Peter Van Ruyven, his sole principal patron that gave him carte blanche to paint what he wanted to paint whenever he needed to, dies. Vermeer's sole source of income is now erased. He's become a desperate man. There is some talk that Vermeer became so desperate that he ends up working for his mother-in-law as the business is starting to flounder. She sends him off to collect a debt. And in his desperation, it seems like Vermeer, he resorted to pocketing the money and not giving it to his mother-in-law, which created a bigger rift in the family. Suffice to say that Vermeer's artistic output took a serious beating here because there was nobody left to buy the paintings. And his health started to wane. He started to get stressed. According to his wife, and some letters after he died from the stress of this crisis that started in 1672 that he was never able to recover from. So his own business ventures started to fail. His mother-in-law's business ventures started to fail. He was running out of money, and he still had mouths to feed. Which takes me to the last painting we're going to discuss today. Again, a very unique painting, which is here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for those who live in New York. The Allegory of Faith, or more specifically, Allegory of the Catholic Faith. It is believed this painting was done, well, it was definitely done after the disaster year and was probably a commission done in desperation. He probably sold it for pennies on the dollars to the Jesuit order that he's been connected to. It is a highly Catholic painting, the most Catholic painting he's ever done, if we look at it. And there are certain things that are atypical of Vermeer, and there's some things that are. First of all, we have the two-point perspective of the marble floor. What's interesting here is that we don't have the Oriental rug anymore. We have this, well, this French tapestry. There's the fleur-de-lis, right? And it's being dragged across and revealing what's going on behind here. Here's a symbol of faith. In the shadows, this woman, whoever she is looking desperately at the crucifix. And this altar with the Bible, and if you don't see it quite over here, this detail, that's the crown of thorns that Jesus wore during the crucifixion. This is the chalice of the Eucharist. She is not, you can't figure out what's going on in her mind. Is it desperation? Is it despair? Is it certainty or just unconditional faith that she's going to pull through all of this? It's all very fragile. It's very tense that she's in the dark behind this curtain. So what happens is this curtain is pulled. She's in the dark hiding behind this. Well, remember we were talking about these secret Catholic churches. This is one of those secret Catholic churches I was talking about. This is one of those attic churches. She's in hiding, praying to her Lord and Savior to help them get through whatever hardship she's going through. Some other allegories as well. The bitten apple. We're not sure if she bit it, but the apple's bitten in the fall of man. The snake, the serpent of Satan, being crushed to death by this cornerstone. And then this obscured chair, which I'm assuming is one of those lion's chairs. And this painting back here of the crucifixion, which I believe they've tracked down. But what happens here is, let's take a look here. Then we have this very unusual device. It's just a bubble of glass, which is depicting, well, I guess a symbol of the fragility of faith and security and stability. It's just, it's a very tense painting. And what's curious as well is the light source is not a window off to the left or the right. The light source is behind the viewer. It's coming from, as the viewer, you can see this, how well illuminated this is. We are looking at, well, one could argue that we're looking into the window of this secret church while she's praying in the dark. And then we're revealing what's going on as we pull this straight back. You know, this is his final eavesdrop. And this may be telling a lot about where Vermeer's head was at and how his faith was rattled and how he was very desperate when he painted this. And as sad as it is, I'm glad he painted it. I mean, there's so much symbolism here. Well, the foot on the way to the world, and we can go on and on. I would suggest you go to the Metropolitan Museum and take a look at it. There's a lot of things here that just don't come well to the reproduction. Ultimately, December 15th, 1675, he dies. He's age 43. He's buried in the family plot in the Protestant church, even though he was a practicing Catholic and all of his children were Catholics. It was a strange agreement that he wasn't buried in the Catholic Church. But that's his tombstone in Delft in the old church to this day. He is so poor and destitute that they're having a fire sale. They're selling everything they can to assuage the debts that he had accrued during the disaster. And the family acquaintance, the father of microbiology and the inventor of the microscope, Antonin van Leeuwenhoek, is actually appointed to be the executor of the estate. And from what we understand, most of the value was in the existing furniture. The paintings were sold off or pawned for pennies on the dollar. And after he dies in 1675, like the Ring of Power in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, he falls from all memory for the next 2 centuries into the void, and nobody ever hears him again. He has no influence. He leaves his wife and family in a lurch. And for 2 centuries, he's all but forgotten until we revisit Mr. Willem Berger, the exile from France, who in the 1840s during his exile is visiting the Rijksmuseum and sees this painting, circling back to the very first painting. He is floored by it. He considers it one of the most amazing paintings ever seen. Who did this? We need to know more about him. I need to know more about him now. He stops doing all of his political agitating and muckraking journalism and commits his entire life from the late 1840s until his death to collecting Vermeer's catalog. He's the first scholar to commit to doing so. And boy, does he do it. The next 20 years of his life, he over-collects Vermeer's. He attributed 70 works to him. Half of them turned out to be from other artists, but he did a pretty good job all in all. But he was the catalyst of Vermeer scholarship. And he's one of the main reasons why we know who he is. One could argue he single-handedly saved Vermeer from falling into the brink of oblivion, and we are forever grateful for that. And because of him, we can go to these beautiful established buildings and see what remains of Vermeer's legacy. And it's there for all of us to see. And it's just amazing that a man who lived his entire life in a small town can touch so many people centuries after his death and leave such a strong legacy. And you can see some of the influences. Some are very subtle influences, some are very strange influences. Mondrian was very big on Vermeer and would break things down. If you look at some of Vermeer's interiors, and if you squint at some of the Vermeer interiors, you can see some of Mondrian's paintings. Salvador Dali was another person who was obsessed with Vermeer, called him the greatest painter that ever lived. Here's an example of one of his surrealist paintings you'll see. I think this was at the St. Petersburg Museum. Woman reading the letter, but he's also creating a pseudo self-portrait of Vermeer. If you step back and squint, there's his eye looking at you. There's his Dutch mustache and the shoulder. Perspective. And then Ed Hopper. This looks a lot like a city street with the same type of voyeurism if you look at Hopper's work. These disengaged female figures quite often. You feel more of an eavesdropper, a voyeur than a viewer. There'd been some scholarship with some controversial works about Vermeer moving forward, like David Hockney's famous book in the early 2000s, Secret Knowledge, where he makes a pretty bold statement I won't get too involved with, where he claimed that pretty much every artist prior to the photographic camera, relied on the camera obscura to create their images. And when he calls out Vermeer, essentially, words to the effect that Vermeer was a cheater. I will agree to disagree. If you get a chance, I would recommend seeing this documentary. Again, highly controversial. Tim's Vermeer, Penn and Teller film, where the inventor Tim Jennison, a brilliant man in his own right, who was a proponent of Hockney's view of Vermeer's approach, copies of Vermeer. He's not even a painter, but after spending a great deal of time, money, and effort, he manages to make this copy using elaborate optics and finding a warehouse that can house this image, and he makes this rather convincing copy of the Vermeer. He even trumps out he trumpets a neuroscientist who claims that Vermeer that it's humanly impossible to duplicate colors and light with the human eye the way Vermeer did without the help of optics and lenses. And my rebuttal would be, how do you know that Vermeer was copying what you think he was copying? I tend to think that he was painting an ideal. He painted quiet, solitary moments because his world wasn't. He cherished the peace and quiet because he came from a hectic environment that was very loud and in a lot of ways very hectic and dark. There's a comparison of the two. If I had more time, I would get involved in how some of these, where I think the replica actually falls short. But I don't think we can ever escape the genius of Vermeer. Whether he used the camera obscura and to what extent, I don't think that he used it as much as Tennyson thinks he did. Before we go, I wanted to make sure each of you get a copy of this missing list. If you happen to see this in a garage sale or at the Salvation Army, the Gardner Museum is going to have a little chat with you. This is the piece that was heisted back in 1990. Whereabouts unknown, no questions asked if returned. Well, that's not my call. And if you're still awake, unlike this woman, I'd like to thank you for joining me for this conversation. And I would also recommend this website, Essential Vermeer. I think it's the best website on the internet about all things Vermeer as far as scholarship and resources and updated material. So I'm available for questions for the next 2 minutes, I think. Anybody have any questions to field here? Let's see. Linda Davies, thank you. Anybody? You can reach me at the Atelier at info@randallliam.com. Oh, I just noticed. Look at that. There's that chair again. And there's that rug again. And this is probably the same model, but I think it's, and remember the painting of Mary and Martha in this pose. And here we are again, looking at a pose of a woman lost in her thoughts by herself. I should point out that the original painting, there was a man and a dog here, but Vermeer knocked it out.
We would like to thank Randall for presenting such an interesting lecture. We hope you found it both engaging and informative. Our next lecture will be on June 20th, will be presented by Helen Harrison. The New Deal for Addie, its history and legacy. Our next exhibit will be the Student Instructor Show Atelier Showcase. Opening reception will be June 13th. And our next workshop will be given by Lana Ballett. Please look out for our emails about lectures, exhibitions, and other upcoming events and classes. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everybody. Good evening.